Okay, hi. This is Danielle Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario. We are studying Moreh Nevukhim, and we are on the webyeshiva.org platform. We've been covering a very significant section of section 2 of the guide, where we are discussing the Rambam's cosmological view. He has broken from his primary philosophical mentor, Aristotle, and has decided to stick with the creation narrative. Chapter 25, which is what we're up to today, is a very important chapter. And the reason why it's an important chapter is because it's almost like a roundup of so many things that we've studied up until now in Moreh Nevukhim. It makes reference to several chapters in the first section of Moreh Nevukhim, and really comprehensively brings us to the point of uh, sort of summarizing all of what we've seen up until now in section 2. And the Rambam really is going to be teaching us something that he had alluded to in the previous chapter, the previous couple of chapters, which is what to do when you're faced with a question of how to resolve a doubt, and also when you can interpret biblical passages literally, and when you have license to interpret them figuratively. All of this is something that we're going to be looking at in this very important chapter, where, and I'm going to bring up the screen to give you a small outline of the chapter, and then we're going to read the end of the chapter inside together. So I guess one of a way you could title or frame this chapter is that figurative or metaphorical biblical interpretation is okay when we have for God's incorporeality, but not for creation. And essentially, if you'll recall, the entire first section, or the majority of the first section of Moreh Nevukhim, was all about distancing God, any kind of corporeality or physicality from God. And one of the great challenges for the Rambam was looking at so many different passages from Tanakh, which seem to attribute physical form and physical qualities of occupying space and motion to God. And the Rambam he felt he had a responsibility to tell us these are not to be interpreted literally. They have to be understood figuratively or metaphorically in order to lisaber et haozen, to allow us to appreciate God, or as the Rambam is wont to quote from Chazal, from our sages, Dibra Torah kilshon bnei Adam. The Torah speaks in the vernacular of human beings to allow us to be able to appreciate a concept about God, even though he's completely outside our purview of comprehension and of experience, because God is completely incorporeal. Now, that said, the question is now going to become, can I do the same with all of those verses in Tanakh that discuss the creation of the universe? If you recall, at the beginning of section 2, the Rambam had said that the most important foundations of belief when thinking about reality is, and thinking about God, probably the most important thing is the belief in God's incorporeality, the fact that he's not in any way confined to any kind of physical attributes. But second to that is a belief in creation. And the Rambam really didn't expand on this idea other than just telling us how important this idea was, that it's necessary to believe that God at some time in history created the universe and created all of existence. And now we're going to really see in this chapter why the Rambam feels that it's so important. So I'm sharing this screen with you. For those who are just listening to the audio, you can look at this outline, or you don't have to look at it because you can listen to the way I'm just going to be reading it from the page. But it is always available on Facebook, in the Facebook community, Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, and it is also available on webyeshiva.org in the course description for this chapter, chapter 25 of section 2. So the Rambam starts off with, and as I mentioned at the very top in bold, This chapter ties together so much of what has been presented in the guide to this point. And so we'll go through it in outline form. Our reason for rejecting Aristotle's eternal universe model. Remember, Aristotle had believed that everything that we see today has eternally existed in some form, in its resemblance to the way it's always been, and everything has necessarily emanated from a non-sentient or non-volitional deity who, by dint of his perfection, necessarily emanates all that we find in our universe. And this has been going on for all of eternity. That was Aristotle's model. And if you'll recall, the Rambam had said that Aristotle's methodology of proof was faulty, was certainly not up to snuff to other areas of science where Aristotle got everything correct. And he says that he emphasized this in chapter 23 as well, that the reason why we don't accept Aristotle's model of an eternal universe is not because of the authority of the biblical text. Why? He says, if we were forced to, we could have interpreted all accounts of creation allegorically, just as we have done for those verses which describe God in corporeal terms. It actually might have been easier to interpret the creation text allegorically for the very simple reason that there are much fewer texts that discuss the creation idea than there are texts that discuss God's corporeality. It might have also been easier because we're not describing a being, but rather describing a process. And that process could easily have been framed in metaphorical terms, and it sort of lends itself more easily for metaphor than does a description of a being, the divine being. However, the Rambam says, so then why can't we interpret the verses metaphorically and allow Aristotle's model of an eternal universe to fit in with the narrative in Tanakh? Maybe when it says Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, that in the beginning God created heaven and earth, it just means that from the human perception of reality, there seems to have been a creation, but not that everything came into existence all anew. So he says we refrain from interpreting the creation texts metaphorically for two reasons. And these are two very important reasons which we're going to focus on. Reason number one, A, we have already used Aristotelian logic to prove that God is incorporeal. Now, what he means by that is we have to really go back to chapter 1 of the second section, which we did several weeks ago, where the Rambam had provided 7 logical Aristotelian proofs of God's incorporeality. And I refer you back to that chapter because we're not going to rehash all of the Aristotelian logic here. But once this has been proven, we are forced from a philosophical standpoint to interpret the texts allegorically. Any text which suggests that God is corporeal will not hold up to absolute proof that God is incorporeal. So we have no choice. However, by contrast, there is nothing that forces us to interpret the creation texts non-literally, since, as we've explained in the previous chapters, Aristotle has failed to prove his assertion that the universe has existed eternally. And because he's failed at that effort, we should not feel that we should twist the verses into a pretzel in order to make them fit into a theory that has not been proven. If we prove that God is incorporeal, then we have no choice. We have to explain that the verses are not meant to be taken literally. And he goes even further. And he says, so that's reason number one, why we should not feel in any way compelled to interpret the verses non-literally. But he says, secondly, believing that God is incorporeal does not present us any challenges to our traditional faith of God, a God who is providential. In other words, if I believe in a God who has no body, I have not said anything or suggested anything that is a challenge to the fundamentals of my faith. There is therefore nothing wrong with interpreting the deity verses metaphorically. But suggesting that the universe is eternal, if we were to even suggest that and say that you can read the verses to fit into an eternal universe model, This presents direct challenges to the fundamental beliefs within Judaism. And as we'll see in just a moment, those fundamental beliefs in Judaism are that God is providential. He is an interactive God and involved directly with our existence. Let me explain what the connection between the two is. The only objection, we're continuing along in this outline, the only objection to our non-literal interpretation is from the ignorant. In other words, the Rambam acknowledges that he has faced certain challenges from members of the Jewish community themselves who believe that you must read the psukim literally when it talks about God in corporeal terms, that God took us out of Egypt with a strong arm, or that God moves from one place to another, or that God's presence is in one place over another. These are all attributions that suggest that there's some physical quality or nature to Hashem. And he says there are people who believe that, but he calls them ignorant. He says, therefore, if that's the only problem or that's the only challenge to this idea of reinterpreting the verses that talk about God's corporeality, that we have to reinterpret them metaphorically, I'm prepared to do so. Now, to whom is the Rambam referring to? It is important to know that the Rambam is critical of certain ignorant chachamim, wise men of his time. And he says this in a number of places, but probably the place where he says it most explicitly is in the very beginning of his Igeret Tchiyat HaMeitim. The Rambam wrote this letter, an epistle, about his belief in the resurrection of the dead very late in life. And he wrote it as a response to many critics of his after they read the Rambam's opinion about what resurrection will be like, and that after the resurrection, people will then die, and Olam Haba will be constituted of disembodied souls. This is a very controversial position of the Rambam that we're not going to get into right now. But the Rambam took a lot of heat for this interpretation, this understanding of what the resurrection of the dead is going to be like. And he also wanted to point out, as sort of like by way of general introduction in this letter, that there are a lot of misconceptions about Jewish ideas, especially about eschatology, about what will happen in the end of all days. And part of this misunderstanding is that people over physicalize, if that's a word, the nature of the spiritual realm, including God himself, that people take verses literally and they are they wish to solidify that which is ethereal and that which is spiritual. And he writes as follows. We're just going to read from a Hebrew translation of the original Arabic letter. He says, Kol shekain shekvar pagashnu adam shehaya nechshav shehaya mechachmei Yisrael. He says, I personally have encountered a man who is highly regarded as a chacham, as a wise man among our people. V'chai Hashem yodea haya derech umasa umatan b'milchamta shel Torah lefi ma chashavto minu urav. He says, and by God, I swear. In other words, this man was a very intelligent man, was a very learned man, and knew how to engage in a very sophisticated level of Torah discourse. V'hu haya mesupak im Hashem geshem ba'al ayin yad v'regel b'nei me'ayim kemo sheba b'psukim o eno guf. And yet, this man who was so sophisticated in his ability to engage in Torah discourse, nevertheless was in doubt as to whether the verses which describe God in corporeal term as having a body, as having eyes, a mouth, arms, intestines, right? As the prophet says, Hamume Ailo, that my intestines yearn for my son Ephraim, right? Are those to be taken literally or not? So Omnam, he says, which is in itself surprising, that someone who was so advanced in his Torah knowledge should still have this in doubt. O eno guf, omnam achim shepagashtim yanshe ktsat aratzot, pasku legamre shuhu guf. He says, and there are other people who I have met from other countries, perhaps not as advanced or not as sophisticated, who take it as a given and emphatically state and declare that God is corporeal, that God has a body. The hechaziku lekofer, and not only that, but they declare that anyone who believes that God is incorporeal is a kofar, is a heretic. And they actually quite openly call such people heretics. והבינו דרשות רבות על פשוטיהן וכיוצא בזה שמעתי על קצת אנשים שלא ראיתי. He says, and they take all of the comments of our sages literally when they should be understood metaphorically. And I've also heard about other people that I have never met who hold the same thing. וכאשר ידעתי באילו העובדים לגמרי שהם מוקצים וחושבים שהם חכמי ישראל. And what's clear is that I know that these people who are really lost and really the rejects from scholarship, nevertheless hold themselves up high as paragons of great wisdom within the Jewish people. Vehem heim haschalim shebivnei adam, but they really are the most foolish of all people. V'yoter to'ei derech mehabehema, they are actually even more misguided than even an animal. וכבר נתמלא מוחם משיגעונות הנשים הזקנות ודמיונם הנפסדות כעיוורים וכנשים. And they are filled, their brains are filled with nonsense, utter nonsense, and their thinking is no different from the women and the senile and the blind and so forth and so on. Well, we're not going to get into the whole depiction of women as being silly or foolish, because that was a different, a bygone era. But nonetheless, you get the idea that the Rambam is basically saying is that there are foolish people who hold themselves up to be quite wise. And he says, I have my detractors, but that doesn't bother me. That would not be enough of a reason for me to interpret the psukim literally. So the only objection to our non-literal interpretation is from the ignorant. But in reality, our reading is very much intended by the Torah. In other words, it is necessary to read the verses in a non-literal sense anytime you encounter a verse that discusses God's corporeality. And just to give you an example, if you go back to page 84 in the Pines edition, back to chapter 36 of section 1, the Rambam had written, this is just a quote, know accordingly that when you believe in the doctrine of corporeality of God, or believe that one of the states of the body belongs to him, you provoke his jealousy and anger, kindle the fire of his wrath, and are a hater, an enemy, and an adversary of God, much more so than the idolater. Recall the Rambam had said that it's bad enough if a person wishes to create a representation of God to worship. But if a person actually attributes to God himself corporeal attributes, that's even worse than idolatry. So it's impossible to read the verses literally. And it's an affront to the very basic tenets of our theology. Doctrinally, it's impossible to interpret God as a physical being. But suggesting that the world necessarily emanated from God for all eternity implies that God is not a being of will. And he says this is the contrast. You have to interpret the verses non-literally when it comes to God's corporeality, because otherwise you encounter theological problems. But the opposite is true if you try to interpret the psukim like Aristotle vis-a-vis the eternality of the universe. If you try to do that, then not only are you not taking the texts at their face value, but you're also doing something which is theologically problematic. You're suggesting by subscribing to this idea of an eternal universe, you're saying something about God himself. Remember, Aristotle's whole idea is that God is non-sentient, not a being of volition, but rather necessarily emanates all of creation and in all of its perfection automatically, without forethought and without will. And if you suggest that God is not a being of will, because you also are suggesting that God is not, the byproduct of this is that God is not consciously willing anything, including miracles, to come into being. This would require us to reinterpret all the narratives of miracles in the Torah as being purely allegorical. Meaning, if God is not interactive with our world because everything happens non-volitionally from God. And therefore, it's like almost like a radio tower transmitting waves of reality from this deity who's the radio tower. Then God is not willfully changing or doing anything dynamically within our universe. And if that's the case, that God is not a being of volition, how do you account for all of the miracles that occur, that have occurred throughout the history of Tanakh? God does not insert himself into creation according to Aristotle. This, and therefore you would be forced to interpret every story of a miracle occurring in a non-literal way as well. The level of taking the text away from its literal meaning would be sort of would border on the absurd. He says this is the way of certain Muslim allegorists, but it suggests crazy imaginings. It means that you'd have to say that people are hallucinating when they claim that a miracle took place. I want to just point out over here, just as a very, very brief aside, that the Rambam does interpret certain miraculous stories that are contained in Tanakh as being in a dream or prophecy. If you recall back from chapter 49 of section 1, the Rambam had said that angels are completely incorporeal. So when you encounter a story in Tanakh of a human being having a physical encounter with an angel, you are forced to conclude that it is a dream or a prophecy. So, for example, when the Torah records that Avraham was visited by three angels, or that Yaakov had a wrestling match with an angel, these are all to be understood according to the Rambam as having occurred in a dream state or a prophetic state. And just to quote the Rambam on page 108 from chapter 49 in section 1, they have made it clear that the angels are not endowed with matter and that outside the mind they have no fixed corporeal shape, but that all such shapes are only to be perceived in the vision of prophecy in consequence of the action of the imagination faculty. But okay, so it is clear that the Rambam does interpret certain miraculous phenomena that are contained in Tanakh as being allegorical or occurring in a prophecy. However, a mass miracle like the splitting of the Red Sea or the opening of the earth to swallow up Korach's community who rebelled against Moshe, that's a physical phenomenon that cannot be interpreted in a non-literal sense. There may be certain Muslim scholars who would want to interpret those things allegorically, non-literally, but the Rambam doesn't buy it. He says, and not only that, but to suggest that God is not capable of miracles because he's a non-volitional being is an affront to something even much more fundamental to our faith, that God is providential, that God is involved with our lives, that God is a provider of schar va'onesh, of reward and punishment. Because if God does everything, emanates everything automatically, then God is not mindful of you and I. And he doesn't take an inventory of everything that we are doing, nor is he prepared to provide recompense or retribution for our behavior. This is clearly an affront to the most basic principles of our faith. So let us go on. If one wished to understand creation as having been like Plato's depiction, then that would also be okay. Now, I want you to recall back in chapter 13 of our section, the Rambam had suggested that there are three ways of understanding how we come to our existence today. We have really focused on two out of those three. One is the creation of creatio ex nihilo, the creation of something from nothing, which is the way the Rambam understands the biblical narrative. And the other one is the Aristotelian belief of eternal existence. But there was a middle position that the Rambam had brought back in chapter 13, which he ascribes to Plato. And the Rambam there had taught us that Plato was of the belief that the world was created at some point in time, but not from nihilo, not from complete nothingness, but rather from some kind of primordial matter that had pre-existed our world. And as a matter of fact, if you recall when we learned that chapter, we cited the Ramban and other commentaries who actually can find supportable texts because after all, the Torah says, V'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu, that the earth was chaos and void, which many commentaries understand was something that existed before the creation process, that there was this primordial, pre-existing matter that was completely without any shape or form. And the creation process is God structuring everything that was in a state of entropy before the act of creation. So this is not a description of creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing, but rather creation from something. But it is nonetheless reflective of a creation process, in which case we are, even according to Plato, suggesting that God is a volitional God who at one point in time inserts himself within our existence to be able to manipulate reality. And he says, therefore, even though I don't subscribe to Plato's depiction of creation, because I prefer to believe in creatio ex nihilo, I feel that it's more in keeping in line with the simple reading of the text. If one were to subscribe to the Platonic model of creation, he would not be theologically out of bounds like he would be if he subscribed to the Aristotelian model of an eternal universe. And he writes that, in fact, there are even texts that might lean in that direction, such as the Haaretz Haita Tohu Vabohu, and Rav Kafach actually points to a verse in Isaiah chapter 51, verse 6, which seems to say that the universe that we know it at one point was all was all entropic and then brought into being, and it will wear out eventually and return to its entropic state, and yet the soul of man is eternal. It implies, and this is something that is discussed by more Kabbalistic thinkers, that we are experiencing a series of continuously reconstructed worlds. According to Rabbeinu Bechaya, who makes mention of this in his Torah commentary, we are the fourth in a series of 7 worlds, and there's much more to be discussed about this. He says, because Plato's theory has never been proved, we will not subscribe to it. We will stick with the literal reading of the creation story, which is indicative of creatio ex nihilo. Even though this account defies all scientific principles, in other words, even though belief in creation from nothing is not reconcilable with Aristotelian science, but nonetheless, the existence of miracles attests to the ability of God to transcend natural law. And therefore, it's a mystery. We don't know how God can create something from nothing, but God can do anything he so wishes, even to violate the rules of nature that he himself created. And that's how the Rambam leaves that issue. And before we conclude, we have to read the very last section inside. Let's take a look at page 329. He says, know that with a belief in the creation of the world and time, all the miracles become possible, and the Torah, the law, becomes possible. Meaning, as you'll see in just a minute what he means by that, and all questions that may be asked on this subject vanish. Thus, it could be said, thus a person could ask the question, why did God choose to give prophecy to one person or one party and not to another? Why did God give the Torah to one nation and not to another? Why did God give the Torah to the Jewish people at the particular time that he did, not earlier nor later? Why are the particular mitzvot contained in the Torah and not different ones? Why are there 613 commandments, and why are they of the nature that they are? Why were some prophets privy to miracles and some prophets were not? And if God wanted us to fulfill the mitzvot, why didn't he make us more in sync with a being who has the greater propensity to fulfill those mitzvot? Why did God create us with a yetzer hara, an evil inclination, which has a natural resistance to the performance of these mitzvot? And the bottom line is, as the Rambam points out, is that once you believe in a volitional God, you may not have all of the answers specifically for these questions, but the whole idea of particularism, which the Rambam had talked about in the context of looking at the celestial realm. And he says, you see all of this particularism, which means that things are not evenly distributed. There are some things that are more dense in one place and less dense in another. Some things move faster or move at a different velocity than other things. You see that certain things are created in such a way that if it was just a natural emanation by dint of the laws of science or just natural rotation of things, we would expect a more uniform universe that does not have any kind of idiosyncratic differences within it. And the same thing could be true about all of reality as well, and why God created the world in the way that he made it, why he created a system of Torah in the particular way that he made it, and so forth and so on. And just to continue reading in the middle of this paragraph, why did he not, if such was his purpose? Oh, sorry. If this were said, the answer to all these questions would be that it would be said he wanted it this way, or his wisdom required it this way. And just as he brought the world into existence, having the form it has when he wanted to, without our knowing his will with regard to this, or in what respect there was wisdom and his particularizing the forms of the world in the time of its creation, in the same way, we do not know his will or the necessity or exigency of his wisdom that caused all the matters about which questions have been posed above to be particularized. If, however, someone says that the world is as it is in virtue of necessity, meaning if you subscribe to the Aristotelian model, it would be a necessary obligation to ask all those questions that we just asked. And there would be no way out of them except through a recourse to unseemly answers. In other words, what in Hebrew is shuvot ra'ot, we'd have to come up with really, really difficult answers that would really be unsatisfying, in which there would be combined the giving the lie to and the annulment of all of the external meanings. You'd have to completely reread all of the texts of the Torah that imply that God is a God of volition. And you'd have to completely, go like this and twist your mind in a pretzel in order to be able to reconcile the simple reading of the text. Okay, and the Rambam says, and no intelligent man has any doubt that they are to be taken in their simple reading, what he calls the external meaning or the pashut pshat. It is then because of this that this opinion is shunned. Therefore, we have to reject this belief in an eternal universe, and that the lives of virtuous men have been and will be spent in investigating this question. In other words, the Rambam says we have no proof that the eternal universe model is accurate. We also have no proof that the creation model is accurate. And that's the reason why Hasidim, virtuous men, spend so much time deliberating over this subject. And ultimately, you have to go, as is discussed in chapter 23, we will have to sort of arbitrate this issue with great wisdom and great virtue until we come to the truth. He says, for if creation and time were demonstrated, if only as Plato understands creation, all the over hasty claims made to us on this point by the philosophers would become void. In other words, if we could prove that the world were created, then we would have no reason to fend off Aristotle and his whole team of philosophers who believe in an eternal universe. But in the same way, if the philosophers were successful in demonstrating eternity, as Aristotle understands it, the Torah as a whole would become void and a shift to other opinions would necessarily take place, especially the theological underpinnings of divine providence and an interactive God. I have thus explained to you everything is bound up with this problem. Know this. This is an extremely important principle. Now remember, in chapter 23, the Rambam had told us that it is possible to come up with some level of objectivity in trying to arbitrate this very difficult question going between the eternal universe model and the creation model. However, at the end of the day, the stakes are very high, because if a person does subscribe to the eternal universe model, it means that God doesn't really care whatsoever as to what we do with our lives. It all is basically up to us to decide how we want to live our lives. God is not mindful of anything that we do. The stakes are not reward and punishment. There's no recompense other than just striving to live a good life, which is what Aristotle advocated. Aristotle did advocate being a virtuous person, but not because it was important to serve God or please God, but rather because this would lead to eudaimonia or eternal happiness. So very, very different systems of belief. The stakes in believing in creation are really as high as believing in a non or in an incorporeal God. And so this is a very important chapter. Worthwhile reviewing this chapter whenever you have a chance. And with this, we're going to conclude. And let me wish you all a very good day and a good week. And we'll see you, God willing, next time for chapter 26. Take care now.